Good afternoon, evening to all you Contra members and purveyors of the G Camp. I'm sure there's a lot of you guys up there right now. I believe it's Scout Course time. I believe Mr. Joe Dolio is up there, and you guys are having a great time. Wisco Mando is up there as well. But instead of having just me talking into the microphone for no reason, we have struggled and been humbled by electronics as normal. And I have Historian on tonight. Historian, would you like to say hello?
All right. Good afternoon. It's good to hear you guys.
And hopefully all this is working out just fine and we have good audio and I should be able to scrub this out. But if you hear a little echo in the background, we'll try to fix that post-production. We are here today with Historian and we're going to be talking about NVIS and his class, but why specifically you should be going to it. What we're going to kind of get into, because Historian's been on Scout's podcast, and I think they've done a very good dive into stuff. I'm going to try to roll us back, and we're going to ask questions for the basic newbie a little bit more. Now, I want you to understand that Historian's class is not what I would call a basic, I've never touched a radio class before, but I want you to think about this a little differently. This is more of what I would assume for classes for leaders and RTO people. And there is a dichotomy between line of sight and what most ham radio operators are usually communicating in. And that's generally that line of sight's, let's say 10 to 12 miles. And you can do further and you can get very skilled, but we're talking about the guys who moderately know how to run their radios versus people who are super experienced, because you can stretch 2 meters and 7 centimeters a long ways without a repeater. But there's this zone that he specifically teaches in his class that's so important, and I think a lot of people don't understand. So Historian, tell us a little bit about your class and why you think that range of conversation is so important.
Wow. Well, HF communication's a huge topic, but to start out with, let's see, how do I say this? So the thing to remember about HF communication is that it gives you beyond line of sight capability. That makes sense?
Yep, totally. And that's the key thing that I think a lot of people are missing out on too, is because the line of sight could be down, let's say in Florida, you may have 10, 12, 14 miles with a handheld in perfect conditions on water, but you may not because of buildings and everything else. But you may be in Appalachistan, which is a whole different dynamic as well.
Oh, yeah. Terrain makes a huge difference. Terrain can help with line of sight if you're up near the top. You know, I've made line of sight communications 100 miles or more without a whole lot of power, but that's not the norm. You know, being up on top of a mountain may not be something that you're able to do. So when you have significant terrain, it doesn't even need to be that significant, but when you've got hills and barriers to line of sight, HF will allow you to overcome those barriers if you pick the right frequencies. And what my class is about is a specific subset of HF. Short skip, well, that's what we used to call it back in the day, or NVIS, near vertical incident skywave. And the idea is that you're using the ionosphere, you're not using any infrastructure, you're not using, any other than what you have available to you and to the people that you're talking to. In many respects, it's a little bit simpler than having to use repeaters or the internet to make your connection. And it is, apart from, geomagnetic storms, solar flares and things like that, which are relatively rare, it's reliable. It works all the time, every time, as long as you pick the right frequencies.
I think that's pretty accurate. So I'm going to try to get people to imagine this. I had a whole conversation with the wife today, and we had two different viewpoints. So I think multiple conversations about this make sense. What he is discussing specifically is you do have a region with your line of sight communications. Your Guerrilla's Guide to the Baofeng that Scout has produced is part of that resource. That is your tactical range of communications. But there's also some more stuff that goes into communications. And that's where I see a lot of stuff, and I've written articles, and I think everybody's talked about Meshtastic now. And it keeps coming back and keeps coming back because it's that theory. If I just put up enough repeaters, I can communicate over long ranges. But there's a whole bunch of downsides to that. And one of them is the same thing that I think Scout said in your last communication. If you don't have control over stuff, do you have the ability to actually communicate securely? And having the ability to communicate securely over further distance than, say, your average 6, 8, 10, 12 miles can be very important. We're going to start out, and I'll talk about this in the disaster. Just Joe Prepper. He's not worried about a civil war going on. He's not in Ireland right now where they've literally shut down the internet to anyone who is dissenting on the issue of an illegal immigrant raping a 10-year-old child. All that stuff aside, why would I want to have this ability? Well, let's talk about the North Carolina floods. Let's talk about earthquakes. Let's talk about hurricanes. All that range with NVIS can be anywhere from 60 miles, which we did in class, no problem. I think we drove an hour, and I've been to his class twice now. The first class was phenomenal. The second class was even better. But what it taught you was a lot of the stuff that I think you guys alluded to. There's not enough Elmers out there. There's not enough people who are teaching stuff, but we learned about the antenna, the building of the antenna, because NVIS isn't just straight, I need a radio that does NVIS. I need an antenna. And I think day one is basically that. Is that correct?
Yeah, we talk a great deal about, and the antenna really is the key piece. I mean, yes, you have to have a radio, right? No argument. But what really makes the difference in any station setup, whether it's portable or permanent, whether it's mobile or fixed, whatever kind of station you have, what drives the train as far as station performance is the antenna that you have and the way in which you set it up. And we go over that in considerable detail. The afternoon of day one, we talk about it in day one, and we talk about frequency selection, and we talk a little bit about radios. But on day two, we actually build the antenna that we use in the field exercise in phase 3. So day one is kind of, if you will, the classroom portion of the class. And we do a lot of classroom stuff on days 2 and 3, but days 2 and 3 are more about, this is how you build your antenna, and this is how you use it. This is how you deploy it. So we go through all that in fairly considerable detail.
And that's the whole start of the whole thing. And that's just the base of it all too, which is important. Don't get me wrong. That communication gap is a ham radio operator who does enjoy the hobby to an extent. And I'll say straight up, my father was a big ham radio nut. He was a big radio nut in general. I brought that up multiple times, but I didn't enjoy, I'm going to say I don't enjoy the FUD of ham radio stuff. I don't care about the goiters, and we do joke about that, but there are people out there that just want to talk about stuff, and I think that's okay. I'm never going to say, oh, you can't do that.
No, there are people talking about things on the air that I wouldn't want to talk about for sure.
Yeah, so you got those guys. It is funny, but the reality is like, it's a multi-level hobby. And when I first got into it, you can to this day still find stuff on like the survivalist forums, which has been around for probably over a decade and a half. And it's just everybody from I'm an experienced person, I know what I'm talking about, to your blind novice who's walking in. And the conversation on communications is just below like the water, the food, and everything else. And I think that's very important because food, water, medicine is probably the 3 top things that you need to worry about on prepping alone as a survivalist, as a political actor who's having to deal with the politics of a nation, maybe being a war in Ukraine or like that. But when we step past that, now we have regional communications. We have that ability to communicate with other teams that we send out, maybe for supplies, and maybe they're not close by, but maybe they can call for help, or maybe you can transmit and find out like maybe your area is totally fine, everything's fine here, and you can communicate to somebody else. But what balances this out with the NVIS is also, NVIS is extremely hard to track down. And Historian has put me on a couple books, but the one that I have been reading recently has been Red November, which you brought up on Scout's podcast too. That thing really drives home how easy it is to direction find a HF station. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about why NVIS is a little more difficult to go find.
Sure. So during World War II, well, even before that, during World War I and in between the wars, but especially during World War II, a lot of the effort was spent by all of the combatants in that war on not only how to communicate securely with your own people, but how to detect and hopefully locate the enemy's radio transmission sites. And just about everybody involved in World War II got into that in a big way, was very effective at it. And the Germans were able, within 15, 20 seconds of the time that the resistance in occupied Europe would transmit, they would be able to know within about a 15 to 20 mile radius exactly where that resistance station was located. And early in the war, 1941-42, they had enough resources available and there were few enough resistance stations available to locate those stations by sending out teams with appropriate shorter range direction finding equipment. And they would be on site typically within 15 minutes of the original transmission. And that ability was one of the reasons why the intelligence branch of the German army was able to completely intercept and take over the Dutch resistance organization through 1943. So that's an early example. Later on, and as you talked about, in Red November, there's an excellent discussion of how the U.S. was able to intercept and then direction find Russian submarines who were making 0.7 of a second long transmissions. And the answer in both cases is that the communication was being done using frequencies and at a particular time of day when it was easy for the direction finding and intercept to pick up what I would call low angle. In other words, low to the horizon signals arriving. Long haul HF, by definition, which reflects off the ionosphere, is coming in at a relatively shallow angle to the horizon. And that's fairly easy to direction find. If you're doing short skip in a non-permissive environment and you're doing it properly, the signals are arriving from anywhere from almost straight overhead to perhaps as much as 45 degrees. And those kinds of signals, which are primarily vertical, are very difficult to direction find. You know, what little DF indication you can get when it's coming in at a high angle like that is very imprecise. The ionosphere is not, a flat mirror reflecting RF. It's dynamic. It changes from minute to minute, hour to hour, and through the course of the day and from day to day. So your expected accuracy when you are trying to direction find high angle signals is very large. It's very difficult to get a reasonably close approximation of location when you're trying to do it with high angle signals. And I'm afraid I've been a bit long-winded, but I hope that answered your question.
No, that's exactly what I wanted you to bring up and communicate too. And this is why the reason why when you get away from the standard disaster preppers and the people who are stuck in Ukraine, stuck in Syria communicating, I guarantee you if you're a Syrian Christian and you have a ham radio and you start spouting anything Christian, they will hunt you down. And it isn't impossible. It's stuff that's common off the shelf. This is part of the reason why I bring it up. We could go into, oh, well, we want frequency hopping, spread spectrum radios, and all this other stuff, and you get into thousands and thousands of dollars. But the core principles of hiding don't really change because when the Russians went to that 7/10 of a transmission, technology at the time hadn't really caught up on the American side to really find out, so they just sounded like they were gone dead silent. We can't physically do that in the modern technology. We have devices now that I can buy for $100 and look at a spectrum on the radio waves, plug in an antenna, and we're there. We can hear you. We can see the spikes. Maybe I don't hear you through headphones, but I can see spike on a monitor and I can have that peak information. I go, there's somebody there. Let's set up some equipment to find that. That becomes very important. Now, let's spread into the hostile environment stuff. And that's kind of what we're talking about. Like, why is it hard to hit? And he was talking about low angle bounces. This is the standard setup for every ham radio operator. So if you go to your local ham radio club, you're going to talk to guys who are trying to get 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 miles out of their systems for competitions, for communicating and making a benchmark and saying, hey, I did this, which is great. I think the technology, and it's something you should learn because you'll understand how to communicate farther and how that operates. But that's the baseline ham radio, guys. So if you got your license and you want to come to this class, you will learn a niche technique that literally I have never seen. And because of my travels, because of my work, I've traveled and just gone to different ham radio groups. I've gone to the winter events for AWRL and all that stuff. And nobody uses this. No one at all uses it. But when you do hear it, when you do hear a local guy, you start realizing, is it an accident? Because before I went to his class, I knew how to run a ham radio, no problem. I did NVIS by accident, mostly because the terrain he teaches you to operate in class, the techniques to make sure that ground wave, which is another thing he talks about massively in that class, is another way to track you down. Not just your low angle, but your ground wave. How do I hide that? How do I communicate and get my message to the people I want and not have it come back? And I think let's dive into a little bit about the ground wave real quick and kind of explain why that's so important and why you need to come to a class to learn how to obfuscate that or how to diminish that.
Okay. So I'll talk about ground wave, and then I want to go back to something you mentioned a couple of exchanges back, and I want to dive into that a little more too. Whenever you transmit on a horizontally polarized dipole antenna, you are generating, because of the nature of physics, and I'm not going to peel all the layers off that onion in this discussion, but you are generating not only line of sight communications and overhead NVIS HF communication, skywave communication, right? You also have vertically polarized RF that is radiated from your antenna system. And one of the goals of the class is to teach you what the factors are that help mitigate that. And those include things like proper frequency selection. They include things like terrain and vegetation, and a host of other factors inhibit ground wave propagation. It is how direction finding was done before World War II even for closer range things, because ground wave propagates depending on the terrain and depending on how much RF you're putting into it. And that goes back to the antenna. Ground wave can propagate for dozens to over 100 miles. So one of the things we talk about is balancing the threat of skywave direction finding against ground wave. And one of the things that, anybody who has studied radio propagation in detail, and I've done that, understands is that the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength, two ways of saying the same thing, the more ground wave propagates. So one of our goals and one of the things we discuss in class is how do you minimize the initial propagation of ground wave? And then once you've done that, how do you mitigate the propagation of ground wave? You want to transmit as little ground wave as you can, and then you want to mitigate or help reduce ground wave propagating across the ground. And most of the folks listening to this may or may not know that ground wave is just what it sounds like. It's RF that follows the surface of the ground. And the lower the frequency, the better ground wave will propagate. Have I kind of Have I kind of the button on that question, G?
Yeah, I think so. And just to be fair on this, I know this is probably digging in the ground for people who don't really understand it. There's a couple different ways, and he explains this in class. And this podcast would be 80 hours long going into everything. And he packs a lot of information in during this class. It's 3 days of just slamming stuff in. The 2-day course that we had originally was brutal. It is like eating through a fire hose, but you will learn so much about NVIS in a short amount of time that actually I feel like it made my communications with the other long jump stuff even better, because I knew where I was messing up to do long jumps and was getting an NVIS by accident. So I can now really tune just a stupid dipole to do what I want even better than originally, just from that class. And you had one other topic you wanted to talk about as well, correct?
Yeah. Well, you were talking about, disaster communications, right? And I listened to the aftermath, the hurricanes this past year, in North Carolina and Tennessee and North Georgia and places like that. And it was interesting and at the same time distressing for me to hear people trying to communicate out of these very mountainous areas, which had been utterly devastated, by this hurricane. It dumped, a foot of rain in a short period of time and just absolutely did the area. Erased Interstate 40 for, I don't know, over 100 miles, I think. Just a dreadful business. And I was listening to people communicating by line of sight using repeaters that had been gotten, that were brought back up and operating. And it was really a shame because that class, we were scheduled to have, I think, 3 or 4 people from the impacted area that were going to come to class several weeks later. And they weren't able to make it because they couldn't get out of the affected area at the time. But and I'm afraid I'm being a bit long-winded, but the point that I wanted to make is that short skip will give you, apart from operating in non-permissive environments, once you understand how to run short skip or NVIS, it will give you the capability to reach outside of your immediate area and make communications, several hundred, 100, 200, 300 miles away without any equipment and without having to go to a high point to get line of sight. You can do it. And, in some instances, you should prefer to do it from inside, at the bottom of a steep valley. You don't need to be way up on top. You don't need to have a really low horizon. You don't need to have line of sight to anywhere. That's one of the beauties of NVIS and why, the U.S. Army used it on D-Day. They used it throughout World War II. The Germans did as well. And why the U.S. Army continued to use those technologies during Korea and certainly a great deal during Vietnam, because they're operating from, triple canopy jungle in steep terrain, steep mountainous terrain. Line of sight just isn't going to happen. And it has tremendous application to disaster preparedness. And I've done presentations in my local area to some of the disaster relief agencies talking about how NVIS is probably a better answer to disaster communications in mountainous regions like Appalachia, where line of sight becomes very difficult to get and requires technology very often to be useful. Apart from the other aspects in which it's useful, the military ones, if you will, for disaster recovery and disaster preparedness, it's an extremely valuable technique. Back to you.
And I think that's a super critical thing to understand too, is this goes out of box canyons. This works for the guys who may live as the crow flies 20 miles, but have a mountain range in between them or something like that. You can bounce over that with this technique. And that's why we kept using it. Now, I know why the US government sent up a whole bunch of satellites to do the same thing. And that was a great idea at the time. Send up a satellite, put a satellite up, geosync orbit. I can communicate out and communicate down with relatively low powered stuff and get a really good signal. What happens when those satellites are gone? What happens when Russia shoots them down or China shoots them down? As much as I think we've watched during the Ukraine-Russian conflict, the advancement of technology, people forget that Russia shot ballistic missiles with no nuclear warhead in there. And they do have the capability of shooting satellites down. As many satellites as there are up, there are not as many communication satellites up that are government issue. Or on that side, even the ham radio operators. And that's a whole nother field of ham radio stuff that we could talk about one day, and I've barely played with. But that technology fails when you don't have a repeater in place. And it's the same thing. NVIS makes repeaters redundant, which is a good thing because part of the stuff I was listening to, some of the repeaters that had been wired onto the internet, and I just popped on there, the 2 meter, 70 centimeter repeaters, and I listened to them during that whole disaster. And if it hadn't been for power getting to them somehow, whether it was generator or whatever else, none of these people had talked. We had a person sit there and get on the repeater who was just like, hey, it's nighttime. We don't have anything. We're okay right now. We got water, we got food, but we can't get out, and we're here and everybody's all right. And he didn't have a ham radio license. And that guy was sitting there going, well, you can't talk on the repeater. And then luckily the net supervisor's like, yes, you can. This is a disaster. He may not be life and limb at the moment, but it's still a disaster. He's still, and some of it's just emotional comfort. So you don't have to have people shooting back and forth at each other to be like, man, I can't communicate with anybody. And some of you guys, I know I've pulled up one horse farmer out in the western region, Texas, flatland, but he doesn't live in a giant Dallas city. He's not going to have tons of neighbors around. That's because some of us don't want to be in cities, me especially. But that connection to humanity, the connection to other people is important. And I think right now, like with what's going on in Ireland alone, just being able to communicate news 500-600 miles for them in Europe and get the real skinny, or even talk a couple hundred miles and know, hey, the government's going to have a real hard time finding me. Are they going to waste the time when they're literally turning the switch off on the internet on anything related to the rape and literally any videos of the protests going on? And that's crazy to me that they can do that now, especially with AI technology. They can filter all that stuff out. Maybe they over filter, but it doesn't matter to them because they've blocked that line of communications. And it's so important now that we can have that communications. Like you were talking about when we had that class, that hurricane came up. I hope to God we don't have any more disasters, because I was out on a 3-week honeymoon and Charlie Kirk got shot. The hurricanes, I believe the last time I was up there also, we had one of the protests go on. So crossing my fingers we don't have any disasters this time. But every time this class comes up, relevant issues related to HF communications somehow hit during your class. And
Well, I sure hope that doesn't happen again, for everybody's sake.
yeah, but with the amount of times this stuff's coming up, and it doesn't always have to be radio stuff, every time you go to train, you will see subtle things that pop up. And I think you talked to Scout about this a little bit, but there was a guy, I believe in Bosnia, during, or was it the siege of Sarajevo or something like that, was communicating outside of that area using ham radio. What if they wanted to go hunt those people down? What if they wanted to find these people? And I see it all the time. Sometimes communications, once the water's out, once the food's out, maybe you have assets somewhere else. I have friends, but if they don't know I'm in trouble or I'm coming to them, what are they going to do? And having your PACE plan that Scout prefaces in his classes and all that other stuff, and you do touch base on all that stuff too, that's extremely important. And you get into some deep details because all of this technology, all this advancement, all these cool stuff, all the encryption stuff doesn't matter when you can't communicate. And that's where the NVIS becomes so important. It's that gap between my line of sight, which may be 1 to 2 miles in an urban environment further, and that long skip, that average ham radio operator who put an antenna up, say 40 feet up, blah, 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 at this frequency. And you also go into what frequencies you should be using, why you should be using them, how you should be using them, how to set up the antenna. Let's build an antenna. Most people I know for ham radio operators, and I was talking to one of my friends, he sent me a nice vertical antenna and he's like, oh, and I've looked up the price. It was ridiculously overpriced. And when you come away from that class, you come away now with an antenna you can use. So even if you didn't have the right antenna when you came to class, you leave with an antenna that you can use on multiple frequencies, which I like. And to be fair, I love your choice of antennas you're doing now, which I believe we're sticking with the link dipole kind of setup. But there's learning how to do that's not, you can look at a book and do it, but it's not that easy to just go, oh, link dipole, but how do you set it up? Where do you set it up? Why do you set it up in a certain way? That's all critical information in that class that you're not going to find in a book. And even the NVIS articles that you've directed me to, the books you've directed me to, don't fully get involved in that because they would have probably a novel that's 500 pages long.
You can spend an awful lot of time, trying to explain how to do it, or you can show somebody 30 seconds some of the techniques we cover in class. We definitely do a lot of skull sweat. We've got a lot I try to start, let me take a step back. I try to start with teaching basic concepts and a high level view of the topic that we're going to cover. And then I move down into the more details and we peel another layer off the onion. I like to use that image. It works. There's always another layer, but we peel enough layers so that when you finish with the class, you come away with the conceptual knowledge as well as some actual practical skills and experience, having built your own antenna from scratch. That's a worthwhile skill all on its own. The day may come when you can't call up DX Engineering or Ham Radio Outlet or Gigaparts or any of the other excellent suppliers out there and buy an antenna. You may have to make one yourself out of improvised materials, and we talk about that in the class as well. And this applies not only to the antenna itself, but also to the transmission line. So those are all skills that we cover in class. And the reason that we cover them is that you can't always be sure that you're going to be able to, have what you need when you need it. And the ability to improvise and overcome and adapt is one of the things that I think is a key part of the class. You get the knowledge to do it. You get some experience doing it. We show you how to do it. And, a lot of the things that I try to cover in class are the fruit of my own persistence and repeated errors. I don't remember how many coax connectors I fried, learning how to solder a coax connector, but I know it was several. My goal is to try to give people practical experience as well as the conceptual background and some of the knowledge to not only understand how, but why. And I'll let you pick it up again for a moment, G, but I wanted to throw that one out there. I want to dive into a little bit more on the different types of communication. And I know Scout's talked about that, and it's an important thing to keep in mind with regard to HF operation as well. Go ahead.
All right. And I love that topic. We'll definitely go back to that. I want to sidestep, and I want to also, I should have done this earlier. I should have said, who needs to go to this class? Because as a prepper, and this has been brought up by Dolio, by Scout, by you name the list of people. You are not an island of one. You cannot do it all by yourself. You can live in a fortified compound with 4 guys, but you still can't, 4 guys and their wives. It's not going to be an easy life. That communication, that networking, that ability to meet people. And we say this all the time, go to classes because you're going to network. Well, when your network's all over the country, and mine's horribly all over the country because of traveling and everything else, sometimes the networking is just like, hey, we need stuff. And just for the listener involved, think about this just if it is a prepper. Hey, we're out in, we'll do Pea Ridge, Arkansas, because I did a whole thing on area intelligence on that place for funsies. If I'm there and I need stuff from Little Rock, I can communicate in that region and get that communication out to a friend pretty easy. You go from there and we step out. Okay, so what about conflict issues? All right, we're in a Syrian environment, churches communicating to get stuff or move people or protect people. And that means leaders need to understand how this works. If you have an RTO guy, if you're in a community, and I know there's communities out there, the RTO guy is going to have as much need for knowledge as the leader. And if you as a leader don't have a good RTO, you're going to have to know this yourself. You're going to have to know how to communicate with other people. But your RTO is the big guy who needs to be out here. So if you're working with line of sight stuff already and you played around with radios and done all the other stuff, I'll call it the Scout Special, his class is RTO, Advanced RTO. That is all line of sight communications. But that next step up is where you get to learn more. You get the infrastructure of I'm in a local town communication to I am now a regional communications person. I am a regional communicator. And it may be something. I don't know how to like express this other ways, but think of Italy. We'll go with Italy. Italy broke up into little city states. Maybe those city states are fighting an invading horde or whatever else. They have to be able to communicate with one another. Fast forward that to modern day, instead of having people run, you're on a radio. 600 miles, 500 miles, 400 miles, 200 miles. Think of all the people in your area. Think of the food resources, even, God forbid, we were laughing about having an EMP to fix the computer issues and all the Google issues is a joke.
Yeah. Don't say that and somebody may be listening. We don't want an EMP.
No.
Believe me, we don't.
The worst thing would be an EMP. Worst thing I could think of is an EMP. And a lot of books out there, prepping books, love the EMP. But when they get down to it, that EMP storyline always has them going to look for food and everything else. And it means traveling more distance than down your street. Well, think of it in a more realistic setting, whether it be a civil war or a war with another country, just prepping in a region that is totally destroyed. Maybe you send people out to go find food or connect with the modern world that has that stuff. Now you can like say, hey, I've got this many people have medical issues at this location, or something has changed where you are, or your team has seen something different. Line of sight doesn't cut it. It really doesn't. And realistically, Meshtastic won't work. I know people build batteries and boxes and everything else. You could throw 10 or 20 of those up, but that stuff has its own issues with, are all the Meshtastic nodes able to communicate with each other? Have they all been updated in the last couple, like 2 or 3 updates? And all that stuff. You lose that ability, and that's where NVIS is just reigned supreme on this, because I could be in Vietnam. I need medevac. I can now communicate with those people. And the nice thing nowadays, too, is the radios have gotten smaller for the most part, other than your base station radio. But even now, and I have not played with it, I think the FTX1 is the radio that you can take basically the amplification unit off of the radio, and you have a QRP rig that you can go out and do that stuff with.
Yeah, that's the successor to the 817, 818.
Yep. And I think
it's a very interesting radio. I have not played with one yet, but I like what I've seen so far.
And that gives you so much more ability. And when we're out at class, we don't use 200 watt or 1,000 watt radios to do NVIS. We're talking at, I think the first class I got down to a half watt in voice.
Yep.
Or maybe it was even a quarter. No, we lost it at a quarter watt. So a half watt for 60 miles means that if I go buy Survival Tech Nord's book on battery powering all this stuff, then I am now set up to probably communicate indefinitely in a several 100-mile radius. And that's phenomenal tech.
Yeah, and the technology is one thing, but what really makes it work is the skill and the understanding of antenna theory and, you know, propagation theory, and understanding a little bit about the ionosphere and, how radio communication works. It's a virtual certainty that, with the exception of extreme solar flares and geomagnetic storms, which are relatively rare, at some point during the day, you will always be able to make a short skip and NVIS communication on one frequency or another. And that, as I said before, varies greatly. But with regard to sustainment comms, tactical or strategic comms, if you're in some sort of military situation or, a shooting war, but, just logistics comms, health and welfare comms, those are all things that people need to have. And we take the internet today for granted, and we take satellite communications today for granted, but they're fragile. The internet is a fragile thing. It depends on a great deal of things all being fully operational. And the same thing is true with satellites as well. They are fragile, and they are not, to your point, they're not hard to destroy. So in the highly unfortunate circumstance that we find ourselves in a shooting war with China or Russia, which is possible, those communication methods are going to be targeted by the Chinese and or the Russians, because they know how dependent the U.S. military is on those things. And it's not just the military, it's a whole lot of other things as well. But so SATCOM is great. And you'd mentioned that, you hadn't really played around with it. I have. I've made a fair number of satellite columns, and I've listened to a lot more. And it's an interesting thing, but the problem is you are only able to use that when the satellite is at an appropriate altitude in your immediate location. You're on the satellite schedule, not on yours. And one of the nice things about short skip HF is that you can pretty much do that anytime if you need to. If you have to make a comm, you can do it 24/7, 365 with no infrastructure. And that's one of the huge advantages of HF generally for all kinds of communication, and particularly with regard to shorter range regional communication. It's available to you 24/7. So anyway, again, I think I've digressed a little bit, but it's an extremely useful tool to have in your toolbox if you're a communicator or if you want reliable communications. So anyway, back to you, G. Right.
As you said, we are so dependent on some of this technology that it can easily mess you up, and it's easy to shut off. The government can shut it off. Even the amateur satellites coming overhead, sure, you can use one, but you got redshift to deal with. You have a limited amount of time, and the time frame is like 10, 15 minutes. Plus, you have to know where it is out in the sky. You got to point your antenna in the right direction to get a good signal contact. You can't just normally throw a dipole down and get one of these things. Usually you need a Yagi or something a little bit more, or you need a little more power than normal.
Right. You need ER, you need effective radiated power, right?
Yeah.
You can get that through a gain antenna, or you can, run more power in a more omnidirectional antenna. I've got several different satellite capable antennas, ranging from something that looks kind of like a big basketball made out of wire to beam antennas and Yagis. And, those things can all be made to work. But to your point, yes, you need to know really precisely, when that satellite is going to be within your range and in what direction and what elevation it is, or you're going to be putting out a lot of power. And there are some circumstances where you probably don't want to be radiating that much line of sight RF. To your point, with voice, we've demonstrated repeatedly during class that you can cover, a wide distance with a very little power, 1 watt to 2 watts on sideband easily. And that means that if you are using digital modes or Morse code, we call CW, you can do it with even less power than that. I've made NVIS contacts with, under a quarter of a watt. And that means that your batteries last a long time, which in an emergency situation, disaster situation, is a big plus. So anyway, as I usually do, I've kind of rambled on. Go ahead, G.
And part of this is conveying how this class is set up is very important. I think the big thing that you come away from is the first step. And I don't want to dissuade. I think part of the thing that you do, that you and Scout kind of post on there, you need a general license or you need to go to the RTO class. It's because this class is not something that you can blindly walk in with no knowledge whatsoever. But in the same respect, you don't have to be a savant in radio communication. You could, if you've had a ham radio and you've been able to communicate with anyone at all, you probably can go to this class. The general license makes it a little easier because you can actually do the actual class practical stuff. So if you don't have your general license, but you've taken the Scout's RTO class and you understand communications a little bit, because he does go over some of this, but he softly touches what you deep dive into, you can go to this class. This isn't something that is as much as it is a fire hose, there's enough people around that come out and actually talk about it and help you through it. Second class through, I helped other people come in and learn stuff. But we've had Battle Gnome out at the last class, and he is very knowledgeable on radio stuff and still highly liked the class and learned a lot from it. I've talked to him since then about it. And that's something. So rolling back, this class isn't just for people who are on the high end spectrum. This is people who want to be able to communicate. This is for people who have a little bit of knowledge, but aren't just brand new. Like, I'm walking up with my radio. I bought an HF radio and set it on the desk, and I have no idea what I'm doing, because you're going to get into some technical stuff that you should know the basics of. But again, most of the basics are covered. If you read The Girl's Guide to the Baofeng Radio and you understood it, and he touches into some of that in the book alone, I think you would, and you have an HF radio, I think you could come to this class. Do you not agree, historian?
Yeah. I don't think it requires a tremendous amount of skill or knowledge. I think people from a wide range of background can get a lot out of it. I think that, the more experience or knowledge you have, the better. But, this is not intended to be an advanced class. This is intended to be a basic class to expose you to HF generally, and more specifically to this particular subset of HF skywave operation in short skip or NVIS, right? No, I don't think you have to have a general license. It's helpful if you do, and it's more helpful if you have some experience operating on HF. But, I don't know anybody regardless of background, that's been in my class that hasn't told me afterwards that they got a great deal out of it. So that's my thought anyway.
Yeah, and like I said, some of the people that came to class weren't very experienced in HF communications, but they'd worked and gotten their stuff. I know a couple people out in the Arkansas region that have just gotten their general license, and I would highly be like, hey, go do it. I don't know if you're going back out to Missouri again. I know there's a conversation about that. But if you do, I'm going to be pushing those guys to go to that class, because it's something that will get them the whole regional experience, the stuff we've been talking about. It's so important. And I just don't want people to go, oh my God, I'm not going to go to that class because it's so in depth. It's HF radio. If you're looking at an HF radio and you go pick one up, and I know Scout sells the 6100, which we used out there, the G90, which we used. And just as a side note, the G90, we set up a pole antenna setup to run the dipole off of. The historian brings to class. It's a military issue gear. And that pole, because we were trying to do something, it fell over and smacked the G90. And that G90 took zero damage. It's the testament to that radio.
I was impressed.
Yep. Smacked the crap out of it. Disconnected the cable, the power cable, but that was it.
Yep. Yeah. And, the point of all this is that there is more to communication than line of sight. And Short skip, or NVIS, near vertical incident skywave, gives the operator a chance to communicate much more widely with very little infrastructure requirement. It's a very good skill set to have if you want to be able to deal with a disaster scenario. It's a very good skill set to have if you're concerned about maintaining communications and the ability to talk to other people. It's useful in a wide variety of scenarios. And, it's also fun, at least I think it is. And I enjoy HF operation. I have since I first got into radio about a long time ago, over 50 years ago. But it can be fun, but it's also a very useful tool to have in your communications toolbox. So if you're serious about communications, learning more about HF generally and learning more about short skip NVIS, I think is a really good thing to be able to do. So anyway, what else do we need to talk about, G?
The only other thing I would say on this is your first class, you brought up how to prevent your radios from getting smoked by an EMP. That's kind of why I brought it up earlier, and I should have said that. There's a lot of nuances in the communications world that you can expand on. You also brought this up in Scout's podcast as well, but there's some early morning and evening communications that I think is super important. And this is, man, I can't say this enough because I am a big nerd on computer games, on specific ones. I love submarines. You won't catch me dead ever in a submarine in war. I think it's one of the most terrifying vessels you could go on. I'd rather fly in a transportation aircraft than be on a submarine in combat. They are super cool. The tactical responsibility of a submarine falls under the guerrilla warfare mindset and the Navy side, so I think there's a very good parallel with that. But like I was saying, you're learning so much more that doesn't just fit into the basics of build antenna, build this. There's that side thing, and you have to experience stuff. So I can take somebody out and play a video game and show them how a submarine works to an extent. But until you go into a real submarine and see it, you don't realize how confining it is, how the World War II stuff is. And this is where you come out to this class and you actually touch the objects and you run the objects and you see the stuff and you even see how he teaches you how the ionosphere works far better than I have had anybody in college or any ham radio operator ever teach me. Not only does he show it to you, you get to experience it. You get to see how it operates, and you also see how it makes communication easier or how you can hide better in it.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do as part of the class, apart from the 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. normal class time, is I have before and after class optional activities where I demonstrate some of the things that we cover in the class so that you can actually hear it and see what happens. You can listen to what happens as the ionosphere changes during the day, the switch from nighttime to daytime, what happens at night, what happens during the day, all of the things that we've covered in class, you actually will have the opportunity to listen to yourself and hear and understand at a gut level the conceptual things and the ideas that I've presented during class. I think that anybody who aspires to really being able to communicate effectively in a variety of circumstance, and we do touch on EMP, among other things, should probably consider coming to class. And yet had anybody come up to me and say, I spent all this money for it and I think I wasted my time. Everybody that I have spoken to and everything I've heard from the attendees have all been that they thought it was definitely worth their time and money. And that's one of my goals, is to make sure the folks that come get what I'm trying to teach, which is, a specific subset of HF communication, and I think a very valuable one. Anyway, I'm hoping that we'll see you in class, whoever you are listening out there. Back to you, G.
I'm going to wrap this up. I think we've gone over most of the stuff. I will say this, that a lot of I spent hours getting people's 6100s and 6200s unlocked. The G90 is really easy to go in, and we had people popping them open and unlocking the capabilities of those radios too. Not everything can be unlocked, but there are people there that will know that stuff or will be able to teach you how to do that as well after hours. And I spent a good evening just fixing people's radios up. So there's more to this class than just the simplicity. There's always, every training class you go to out at Scouts course, there's more than just what he's teaching. If he's teaching you to shoot a rifle, there's more than that. And you'll get more out of historian's class than you'll ever imagine and you could ever pay for online on a video call or something like that. So I hope to see some of you guys out there. I hope to go to every one of historian's classes I can, and I hope that he has his Missouri class at some point as well too, so I can get even more people out there.
Yeah,
Anything else?
in discussion about another Missouri class, and I think that's going to happen sometime next year. We haven't set a date yet, but that's in the works.
Yeah, I hope you get your book done sooner than later. Really gnashing at the teeth for that, but I understand how difficult that is, knowing multiple authors. All right.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, I'm finding it more of a challenge than I had envisioned, and I knew that it was going to be a challenge.
well, on that note, I think we're going to cut this off and keep your shovel sharp. Don't be a loot drop, and I hope to see you guys at a historian's class. Good night.